All right. Hello and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about anxiety and depression. And so my name is Matt Cotty. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the founder of Restored Minds. And on this episode, I really want to dive into the anxiety and depression connection because, there's a good chance that most of us have experienced these two feeling states. It just varies to the degree at which we've experienced them, right? Because there's a broad spectrum of anxiety and there's a broad spectrum of depression. There's a low level, kind of low grade, just feeling down or feeling a little depressed. And then there's, debilitating depression where you just can't get out of bed. And then with anxiety, there's a low kind of like jitteriness, right? Like, even something that we'd feel before, like not necessarily even bad, just like something we'd get excited about, a date or presentation at work. And then there's, full-blown panic attacks, right? And everything in between. And, I think that a lot of people that at least that I talk with that, reach out online, one of the things that we do is we assume that all these feeling states are bad, right? And because they're bad, we are more hypervigilant to when we experience them. And then when we don't want to experience them, we try to suppress them, which then actually makes them worse and prolongs our experience, right? Carl Jung famously said, what you resist persists, right? And when it comes to anxiety and depression, if you're experiencing both of them, one of the most important things is to understand is that we need to realize which one's the primary and which one's the secondary, right? Because it can happen where, and also kind of like, was there any kind of event that led up to that feeling state, right? Because let's just use depression as an example, which again, depression is a symptom of high levels of stress, right? That's our body is actually, can get depressed from a very high level of stress. It's a stress related disorder, which most people don't realize, right? And so when it comes to depression, like if there's an actual event, like a very, tragic event that happened or a big loss or some kind of major transition, and then you feel depressed after, I mean, obviously that would be the catalyst event, right? Let's say like losing a job. And then the catalyst event would make you feel, or put you into a state of depression, right? And that stress of that event actually is what would cause that, right? And that would be the primary symptom. And then what happens sometimes is people will get anxious about getting depressed, right? And so they'll be really anxious, like, am I going to feel depressed like this? How long am I going to feel like this, right? And the anxiety will start to fuel that depression, right? And if we flip the other way, right, a lot of people that have a lot of anxiety will often get depressed about feeling anxious, right? Because when we're in an anxious state, it can be very uncomfortable, and being in that state of stress can actually lead to feelings of depression, right? And that's why when it comes to treating this, or really working through these issues, it's important to realize which one is the primary and which one is the secondary in your life, or at this state of your life, right? Because, you can experience both, right? So I just want to go ahead and start off with that one point right there of just identifying the primary and identifying the secondary, because when you treat the primary, usually the secondary will alleviate, right? So people who have, let's say, OCD, it's very common that people in a state of OCD, especially for a prolonged period of time, will, be in a state of depression. And that's actually, in many cases, oftentimes what they're seeking help for. And so if you're someone who works with someone, it's so important that you understand, hey, realizing why the person's depressed. Because if they're depressed because of the OCD, if we try to treat the depression, it's not going to help them because the OCD is still going to be there, right? And this in the same way, if they're anxious, but they just had this major life change and we're not going through that process correctly, treating the anxiety is not going to help them either. And so realizing how these connect and play off each other is important, because we want to make sure that you're getting the right kind of assistance at the right period and time of your life. And in realizing that they're both tied into stress in general, right? And that high levels of stress are going to, in many cases, lead to a feeling of depression. In fact, I think it was Jim Carrey, the actor, He said it really well. Like when you're in a state of depression, right, it's your body going into deep rest, right? And I believe I'm quoting that correctly, so I apologize if I'm not. But that idea that your body's just so tapped out that it needs to kind of like calm down, shut down to, almost recuperate and recover. And realizing that these feeling states, while uncomfortable, while really tough to go through, are a normal part of being human, right? Like anxiety is a normal part of being human. Feeling depressed, feeling sad, there's a normalcy to it, right? It's not that you should always be in that state. If you're in this state for a long period of time, right, that's obviously a problem, and that's how we actually qualify it as a problem, right? Because if someone loses a family member, or like has some kind of major life event, and then they feel depressed after, it's like, well, that's like, of course, right? Like we would expect that, right? And that's where we need to be careful about judging our feeling states as, quote, good or bad, right? Because again, it's not that feeling these ways is necessarily a sign that there's a serious problem, right? It's more that it can be just a very natural reaction to things. Things happen and you can feel anxiety, like that's a normal thing. But it's actually when we try not to feel these that we actually fuel them and perpetuate them and often make them worse. And, there's so many different cases of this, so I'm not going to pretend to, try to list them all. And there obviously are serious situations that like where you should get help, right? Of course. But we also need to the key point that I really want to talk about with this anxiety and depression connection is first figuring out which one is the primary and which one's the secondary. Okay. And then seeking the help for the primary, right? The one that's the first symptom. And then also really normalizing the idea that these are feelings that will probably cross your path at some point in life. It's just not an inevitability, but it's something that is a normal experience. These feeling states are normal. And it's something that you will go through and work through, though. And the more and more you're willing to experience them and actually allow them to surface, that actually is what allows you to go through them, right? And and the thing I really want to point out is that our resistance to these uncomfortable feelings is actually what perpetuates them, and in most cases, anyway. So when you're in these kind of feeling states, right, understanding which one you're working on first, and obviously using the correct tools at that time, right, and using the tools to go through it, but also not only trying to get rid of that feeling state, right? Really kind of noticing like what happened that caused it, right? Was there a leading event, a catalyst, an event that actually is directly related to this feeling state? Because many times people are just unaware of that. They'll have this major life event and then they'll show up and say, well, I'm feeling really depressed, and they can't put those together. So really kind of asking yourself, like, when did this start? How long has it been going? Did something trigger this, right? And just becoming more attuned to like what you're experiencing, and also just taking care of yourself when you're in these states is really important as well, and not trying to rush out of them, right? Because again, the harder you try to get out of them, again, most times it works in a paradoxical effect. So again, making sure that you're targeting the right one if you're dealing with both of these, and then also working through it on the correct path and the correct timeline, to not, instead of trying to just get yourself out. Because what happens is when you try to just get yourself out of a state of anxiety and depression, you're constantly evaluating if you're depressed or if you're anxious, because you see that as a problem. And then what happens is that the more you notice it, the more upset you get at it and the more reactive you get at it. And then it just starts to build and build and build and build. So really giving yourself permission in many cases to feel uncomfortable feelings is such a powerful technique and process when it comes to dealing with things like anxiety and depression, because again, normalizing it, right? Again, telling yourself like, no, you know what, in this world, you're not only supposed to feel the feeling of happiness 24/7. It's like there are things that are going to happen, and giving yourself permission to go through those things, right? And to use those as growth opportunities, I think is a very, very powerful and very real thing that most of us don't know how to do, right? Or that we're all still learning how to do, I should say. And the more and more we can practice that, we won't be as reactive to the feelings in the future, and we'll give ourselves permission to kind of allow our bodies to process what they need to process. So hopefully you found this helpful today. And again, if you did, we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, as well as, subscribing on iTunes, and, leaving a comment, letting us know any kind of videos and or episodes you want us to make in the future. And as well, we have some additional resources to help you out on your journey over at restoredminds.com. We have some links right down in the video below, or in the notes below, where you can get access to those. And again, they're free. You can download them or go through some of our additional trainings just to support you on this journey. So thank you so much for taking the time to hang out today, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next episode. Take care.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.